Zuko was not under the umbrella. Instead, he was walking with the grumbling, confrontational Sokka as the Warrior Tribe team complained about fortune-telling. This was not Zuko's choice. He would rather be under the umbrella. In fact, the Traveler had handed it to him, but Katara was very obviously still grudgingly, reluctantly tolerating his presence, and when she reached for it, he handed it over without thinking. Now, it was raining, and to actually get under the umbrella would mean moving even closer to her, or to Aang, who was fine in and of himself, but would lead to a glare from Katara. Zuko didn't even get it. She hadn't said a word about him and Aang going off together in the Great Divide, but ever since Aang had been captured by the Fire Nation while she'd been sick, she'd gone even frostier toward him. Never mind that he was the one who rescued Aang from Biohole's stronghold. Never mind that he tried to take care of them while they were sick. No, she was even more focused on Fire Nation bad, and while that jerk Zhao certainly fit the bill, he didn't really think the other man's actions would lead to him getting soaked. Well, him putting a frozen frog in her mouth probably didn't help. He hung back a bit as they made into town and were directed to the fortune-teller's hut, separated far enough that it caught Sokka's attention. "What are you doing, man? I know this is going to be a huge waste of time, but Katara is really excited for it. Girls love getting their fortunes told," the teen said with a roll of his eye, and for a moment the rain falling directly on him turned to hail. "Hey!" he yelped, throwing his hands over his head. "Oops, my bad," Katara said blandly, not seeming to the least bit sorry. Sokka opened his mouth to retort, but Zuko raised his still shackled hand between them to hold off the sibling bickering. "I think we finally hit a town that's big enough to have a blacksmith. Or a locksmith. I'm going to see if I can find someone who'll be able to remove this." Sokka's grumpy expression changed completely, and even Katara's icy glare relaxed a bit as Aang beamed at him. "That's a great idea," the youngest member of the team cheered. "Do you want someone to go with you?" Sokka asked, and Zuko immediately shook his head. "This will probably take a while. You guys go ahead. I'll find you once I know if it can come off." Sokka looked uncertain, but that seemed to satisfy Katara. She nodded and started for the fortune-teller's hut once more. Aang, scrambling to follow, stood under the umbrella. Sokka hesitated, as though to ask if Zuko was sure, but the firebender turned away, heart beating in his chest as he heard silence behind him. Finally, after a few seconds, Zuko heard footsteps behind him, finally moving the other way as Sokka ran to catch up with Aang and Katara. The Fire Nation team let out a loud, deep breath of relief. He couldn't risk going to a fortune-teller with the others. If this Aunt Wu could read his past as well as his future, who knew what she would be able to blab to the others? Sokka knew. Some of it. Not all. Not enough. Too much. Zuko had heard them discuss too many plans of defeating the Fire Lord to confess that he was their enemy's son. Would they use that? Use him? They could try to hold him hostage, threaten him or his life if Father didn't comply. He wouldn't, but Zuko wasn't sure he could convince them of that. Maybe they would think he was a threat and try and take him out, remove a potential complication before it became an actual one. Maybe Aang and Sokka wouldn't like him anymore. He wasn't sure why, but that created a pit in his stomach even greater than his other fears. He was electing to ignore that, push past the fear in favor of making sure it didn't come into fruition. For now, that involved making sure he was never in the same vicinity as his Aunt Wu lady and the other three at the same time. If he could get this stupid manacle off at the same time, well then, that was even better. It was a no-go in the locksmith, but he easily followed the clanging sound of an anvil to the blacksmith, finding a muscular man sweating in the heat of a forge as he created shoes for an ostrich horse. The man looked up as Zuko entered, his brow furrowed the way most men's did when faced with a stranger in a town where every face was familiar. His eyes lingered on Zuko's left side for a moment, and the firebender had to fight not to shudder. He wasn't quite used to that. By the time he was coherent on the ship, the sailors were used to his bandages, and none of the freedom fighters had really acknowledged his injured side other than to exploit his loss of senses or target it to cause pain, or get Mediman to check on it. He hadn't had to actually face people's reactions to his disfigurement until Sokka. It was something that should have started years ago. He should be used to it now. He wasn't. The blacksmith's face cleared after a moment and shifted to meet Zuko's eyes. "Hello, stranger. You here to get your fortune told by Aunt Wu?" Zuko shook his head. "I'm just traveling with some companions. They're visiting your fortune teller now." "Not you?" No. Is that a problem?" "Unusual," the man said without actually answering the questions. "Well, it must be important if you're not interested in learning about your future. What can I do for you?" Zuko brandished the arm with a manacle. I was hoping maybe you'd be able to move this." The man inhaled sharply and cursed, crossing the cramped and cluttered space with a dexterity contradictory to his bulky frame. Within seconds, he was only an inch away from Zuko, his hands hovering over the teen's covered wrists. "May I?" he asked hesitantly, and Zuko nodded, shoving his arm into the man's hands. Better just get things over with. The man's expression darkened as he examined the manacle, digging into skin in a way that only growing into it from a smaller size could achieve. That, mixed with the clearly aged scars peeking out from behind his still healing wounds on his wrist, painted a very clear picture of exactly how long he had been held captive. A burn scar that marred his face, and the smaller burns peeking out from along his arm, a natural result of being a child firebender, unnatural results of never being enough for his father and teachers and masters, and somewhat natural marks that came from growing up with a child prodigy who sometimes didn't quite realize their own power, as well as the strong Fire Nation steel on his wrist, painted an equally clear picture, despite how wrong the picture was. Zuko wasn't about to correct the man, though. Not when child prisoner of the Fire Nation, for who knows what, would garner so much more sympathy than Firebender held captive by Earth Kingdom freedom fighters. Can you get it?" The man nodded, expression still dark. "You're lucky. This is an older style with a padlock on the outside. Some of the newer ones have the lock built into it. That would have been much harder to remove, assuming I even could with how much it would dig into your skin. This will take a hot minute to get through the padlock, but I should be able to do it without injuring you." The man pulled a file and some pliers off the wall and went to work. The sound was grating, a harsh collision of metal on metal that had Zuko gritting his teeth, tensing his shoulder the whole time as the man worked. The blacksmith, annoyingly, seemed to be completely impervious to the obnoxious noise. In fact, he just kept talking, as though the worst sound in the world wasn't happening to be 2 feet from his face. He spoke about Aunt Wu the whole time, about how she told him exactly where to go and what to bring to meet his now wife, how she had helped him to decide on being a blacksmith when he was looking for an apprenticeship, how she predicted the weather and the risk of the volcano erupting. Something pulled at Zuko that mentioned the volcano, the pit of discomfort that had been building in his stomach ever since they landed. There was a pressure in his chest, like how his stomach sometimes swooped when Appa moved too quickly. However, before he could follow that train of thought, he heard a snap and looked down to see that, during his distraction, the man had taken a pair of thick cutters to the filed-down padlock. Zuko let out a shudder, disbelieving breath as he pried the manacle off his wrists. The skin underneath somehow even paler than the rest of him, except for where the edges of the metal had been, which was ringed with scars both old and new. You did it," he said with absolute wonder. It's actually gone." Was it weird that he actually felt colder? That the wind rushing across it for the first time in years felt so unnatural that it was almost uncomfortable? "Thank you," he finally stammered, dropping into a formal bow. The man simply shook his head. "You don't have to thank me for something like this, kid." Zuko rose out of his bow and had the simple, traitorous thought that the backwater Earth Kingdom peasant had more honor than most of the members of the Cordelia royal court. He wasn't quite sure what to do with that information. The problem was not that Zuko didn't realize that half of his decisions were bad ideas. He was fully aware that they were very stupid situations. The thing was, though, he was very intimate with the concept of risk versus reward, and he was simply a little less risk-aversion than the average individual. He had to be, with a sister like Azula. He would never get ahead by playing it safe. He hadn't gotten ahead by being risky, either. The real problem was the proportion of time that his risks did not pay off versus the time they did was a bit skewed. Showing his firebending off to grandfather after Zula? Fail. Sneaking into a war meeting? Fail. Speaking up during the meeting? Also fail. Agreeing to the Agni Kai? You get the point. But he knew father. He knew that life in the fire court entailed. If he hadn't at least tried, he never would have even had a chance at making a name for himself. Perhaps someone else could have looked at the list and thought they should be less risky. But that someone was not Zuko. He wouldn't give up without a fight, and he fought every step of the way. That is to say, Zuko knew it was stupid to go to the fortune teller. But here he was, eating bean puffs as a little girl with weird pigtails sighed out the window like someone from the Ember Island Players, pretending to be in love. He blamed the blacksmith. He really did. He'd made a decision earlier not to, and for very good reasons. There is no reason to believe that anyone from the Earth Kingdom wouldn't immediately hate him with extreme prejudice, like the freedom fighters, as soon as they realized what he was. And they would, if they were as skilled as was rumored, or worse, who he was. Not even the Avatar and the others knew who he was. He was eating gross bean puffs instants before being captured, again, or killed. But, and that's the thing, there always seems to be a but. But the blacksmith said that Aunt Wu was incredible, that they could tell a man's destiny at a single glance, and Zuko, well, he didn't know what to do. The gang didn't need him, even if they did ever actually trust him. Should they trust him? Why would they need some non-bender tagging along? They already had one, and Sokka had a lot less baggage, and wasn't immediately distrusted the instant someone saw his eyes. Even if he could bend, he just couldn't trust his luck enough to believe that there was an actual chance that they wouldn't eventually discover who he was. Long story short, whatever he was doing now, it wasn't sustainable. It would end sooner than he liked based on historic precedents. And then what? Would he look for Uncle? Wander the Earth Kingdom? Take up arms against his father? Try and get back to the Fire Nation? Would he ever get his bending back? How would that affect things? He felt lost, for once completely devoid of destiny. He once thought it was his destiny to support his cousin's rule as an advisor or general. Lu Tin had once jokingly promised to give governance of Ba Sing Se to his favorite cousin. Azula and he had fought for hours over who he meant, but when either of them asked the third in line, he had simply winked and refused to clarify. Then, he thought it was his destiny to become the Fire Lord, and had done his best to work toward being worthy of the task. Then he thought his destiny was to die once Jet learned the truth, never seeing the sun's light again. Now, he didn't know. His destiny had always seemed to be clear-cut, but now, he needed guidance, and if this woman could give it, then the reward would well be worth the risk. Probably. After a moment, a bell rang, and the little girl turned to Zuko. "Aunt Wu will see you now." Zuko took in a deep, shuddering breath. It was time to discover his destiny. Or time to be in prison yet again. The fortune-telling room was ornately decorated, with shelves cluttered with odd-looking gear. The fortune-teller herself was also ornately decorated, in a nearly gaudy dress with jingling jewels. Zuko gave a formal bow. "Aunt Wu, I thank you for seeing me. Please, I wish to know my destiny." The woman stroked her chin before gesturing to a mat on the floor. "Greetings, Seeker of Truth. Come and sit. You will soon learn your path." Zuko moved into his seiza for a moment before remembering it was a strictly Fire Nation position and changed it last minute to a simple kneeling position. He looked up to see that despite matching his earlier formality, the woman had a warm, casual smile as she sat across from him. "Your destiny, you say?" "Yes, please." She hummed for a moment before moving and pulling a new, small candlestick out of a box. She placed it on a plate, which had a small spike in the center to keep the candle steady, and lit the wick with a burning bit of one of the incense sticks that had filled the room with a fragrant smog. She handed Zuko the plate, and it felt so much like many of his meditation lessons, that he instinctively reached for the fire with his inner flame. Nothing happened. His still weak chi stirred, but the lick of flame jumped and flickered freely. It was a good thing. If he had manipulated it, then it would have been even more obvious who he was. He'd always been a bad liar. "What is this?" he asked. "Shromancy. Fortune-telling is not cut and dry, child. Anyone who tells you otherwise is a charlatan seeking your coin. I promise you, you won't hear a word from them that doesn't end with the promise that a charm would solve your problems. There are different methods to seek the future, and some ways work better than others, so I like to think myself an expert in determining which method will work best. Tea leaves are common, as is my crystal ball. Sometimes I can just look at a person's face, the markings, and tell." Zuko flinched and touched his scarred cheek at that, and the woman cast an apologetic grimace, but didn't mention it before continuing. "For you, however, Shromancy seemed to be the best fit. I don't get to often use this method, but I can certainly still read the wax. Unfortunately, this method takes a bit of time. The candle is small, though, and should be melted soon enough." Zuko nodded, but said nothing more. Aunt Wu sipped at a cup of tea as she attempted to coax him into conversation, but the teen was too wary to give up his identity to give more than stilted, monosyllable answers. Eventually she gave up, placing a cup of tea near Zuko's knee. The boy didn't take it. Instead, he stared at the wild, flickering flame and just breathed. It was peaceful, not meditative in the way he used to, but still freeing. After what seemed like no time at all, the woman gently took the candle from his hands and lifted it slightly toward his face. "Please blow it out," she requested as he fought not to flinch. He quickly snuffed the flame and sat still as she gently turned the candle. She hummed, brows high and surprised. "Oh my, I see a great destiny is ahead of you. I see signs of prosperity, hope, balance. I see a beloved leader of men, or, that's odd. This part, I originally thought it was a symbol for a leader, but from this angle, it looks like the symbol for fire. I apologize, but you would give me a moment, I can check my books to see." But Zuko was shaking his head, his heart having sunk. "No need. This didn't work. I used to think that was my destiny, but not anymore." The woman locked her eyes with him. Her expression gave away nothing as he stood to leave. "Destiny is not so fragile as that, Your Highness. It is durable, and like a vase may be molded, carved, blown, or bent. There are many ways to make it. I will not give up so easily, on it, or on yourself." Zuko shook his head. She didn't understand. He had ruined his chance of that future years ago. For her to dangle that in front of him, even unknowingly, was cruel. Now he didn't even know what to hope for his future. He felt a flash of fear grip his heart. Did that mean he had lost his destiny? That since he had been too weak, too insufficient for that future, he was doomed not to have one? Was he to die young, or fade into obscurity? Suddenly there was a stick of mango slices shoved into his face. "Why so glum, chum?" Sokka asked around a bit of papaya. Zuko accepted the fruit. "Aunt Wu was wrong about my destiny." "Oh, duh, that woman is a quack. She didn't even do the fortune-telling mumbo-jumbo to me, just looked at me and said I would bring myself misfortune. Whatever that means. And these people here are completely whipped. This merchant, gave me this scarf for almost nothing because she told him to. It's crazy, this stuff doesn't work." Sometimes it was almost comforting for Zuko to be ignored in favor of Sokka's ranting. Even if the firebender didn't agree, to see the boy's passion and animation, regardless of Zuko's funk, eased something that the type of mothering or sympathy would not have. It was nice to see Sokka so much himself. Zuko took a bite of the mango and hummed. It was perfectly ripe and sweet. It was only missing... "Do you think they have any chili powder for this?" Sokka blinked at him blankly. Zuko, this is a mango. It's a fruit. I know. And you still want chilies on it? Yes? What? And at least he wasn't complaining about the fortune teller anymore. Zuko wasn't exactly sure what he should be doing anymore. Katara seemed to see she needed Aunt Wu's guidance on everything, up to what outfit she should wear on a given day. Sokka was determined to make an enemy of every townsperson via loudly arguing against their way of life, and Aang was obsessed with impressing Katara. At least one was not terribly out of character, even if it had taken up a degree or two. Zuko had no intention of seeing Aunt Wu again after that last time. He was lucky she hadn't realized what the sign of fire could mean, which meant that he had to do nothing more than stand around and get secondhand embarrassment by watching his friends. And that little pigtail girl. What's worse, he was having some kind of attack of some sort. No, attack was too strong a word. But there was a pressure building in his chest, a bit of a tickle at the back of his mind. He didn't know what it was, and it wasn't even consistent enough to go to a healer about. But he didn't like that feeling. He was almost relieved the day that Wu appeared before the town to predict the fate of the volcano. It was at least a change of pace. It turned out to be nothing more than some staring at the sky and an announcement done in 5 seconds. Sokka complaining about it lasted 5 times as long as the actual event. Zuko was bored enough that when Aang asked if he wanted to join his quest to find a flower, he actually agreed. Luckily, Katara was so obsessed with learning more about Aunt Wu's predictions that she didn't even notice enough to glare. Aang predictably chattered the whole time, which at first was exhausting to follow, but became easier once Zuko realized he was mostly talking to himself, and the firebender could fulfill his social requirements with a few occasional hums and grunts. He was already regretting this. The further they walked, the worse his weird chest pressure got. Maybe he should see the healer. Was it the altitude? It seemed to get worse as they climbed the mountain that formed the dormant volcano, but no, that doesn't make sense. He was fine on Appa. Suddenly, Aang spotted the famed flower, growing at the lip of the volcano crater. He was practically vibrating with excitement, so Zuko gave him the go-to wind on ahead, and settled on the base of the mountain to settle himself and take a breather. His time in the cave had been short bursts of intense need. He had little to no need for endurance, or cardio. He was just going to sit here for a second. Apparently a literal second, as Aang was already careening down the volcano face. Did he even have the flower? Honestly, he couldn't leave him alone for 5 seconds. Volcano! Aang shouted. The volcano is active! Zuko was suddenly struck with a dizzying sense of vertigo as he connected that claim with the strange pressure he'd been feeling. His people had thrived on volcanic islands for decades, mainly because the inner fire of the magma would call out to that of the benders, a gift from Agni which allowed them to sense impending eruptions. In the back of his mind, he realized that if the volcano was speaking to his inner flame, that it would be good news for his potential bending, but that was not the important thing at the moment as he and Aang sprinted through the woods to the town. The airbender pulled out his staff and reached a hand to Zuko, who took it reflexively, then found his eyes popping out of his head as they floated above the ground, and he had nothing but the grip of a 12-year-old keeping him from plummeting to his death. Yes, he knew he made bad choices, but not as bad as the choices as the townspeople of Makpu, who simply meandered around the courtyard without heeding Aang's warnings, even after an eruption rocked the ground and sent a plume of smoke rising from the volcano. They dismissed their every warning, casually disbelieving in a way that would send even smoke pouring out of Zuko's ears if he had been capable of any bending whatsoever. In the end, the group of children were ignored, left completely alone. What do we do now? They just won't listen to reason, Katara bemoaned. But they will listen to Aunt Wu, Aang said, suddenly looking excited. That's the problem, Sokka said angrily. But something about the boy's excitement was burrowing into Zuko's mind as he slowly caught on. I can get the book without her realizing it. Are you sure? Yes, Zuko said simply. Living in a palace with father and Azula was a giant game of hide-and-seek when tempers flared, nearly always, and had dire consequences for losing. He knew how to get around without anyone realizing. Hard to argue with that, Sokka said as Zuko refrained from adding any additional information. The teen dutifully ignored the scowl on Katara's face as she was forcibly reminded that Zuko existed. But then what? We hope a fancy cloud comes? They don't actually predict things. Well, clouds are made of air and water, so between the two of us, we ought to be able to bend them into any shape we want. With grim nods, they scattered. Sokka to wrangle Appa, Katara and Aang to prepare to cloud bend, and Zuko to steal a book, and hope that the fortune-teller didn't see it coming. Yes, he knew he made bad decisions. In retrospect, it was almost insultingly easy to steal the book. Aunt Wu had just left it sitting behind on a decorative table as she spoke to a client. There were no guards, not even a bystander they had to avoid. If he weren't stealing it in order to save a village from certain doom, he would have called it boring. He walked out of the fortune-teller's hut moments after entering, book in hand. He went to hand it to Aang, only to see that he was awkwardly walking away from the girl who had been stalking him, as she watched him forlornly, though with more acceptance than Zuko had seen earlier. He was glad he hadn't had to sit through that conversation. He stayed behind as the others took to Appa to change the clouds, Sokka with the book on his lap and the bender standing ready, unwilling to risk distracting Katara. As the clouds shifted, he cried for the fortune-teller, refusing to be befuddled until she had no choice but to come out and see the rapidly shifting skyscape. Their plan worked. It actually worked, somehow. Soon, Aang was addressing the crowd and encouraging them to work together to stop the volcano. Zuko and Sokka had already gone over a map, and the Fire Nation Tina explained what the path of the lava would likely be. The trenches were common among the Fire Nation as prevention methods, especially since the war, when the firebenders that could bend the heat out of the magma had been sent to the front lines. Sokka glanced at Zuko as the town people scattered to get shovels. You sure there aren't any other cool firebending things you can do to help? I'm not a firebender! Zuko spat, his impotence and helplessness curling in him, revealing itself as fury. Not anymore. Angus? Katara reluctantly allowed. Kinda. Zuko eyed him. There are legends that say that Avatar Roku used to be able to bend magma, but I don't know if that's firebending. I wouldn't know how to teach it even if it was. I could try and talk him through bending out the heat, but without my own bending or any way to give an example. Aang shook his head. Then for now, let's focus on making the trenches. That's more important. Maybe if I really need it, I can go into the Avatar state and Avatar Roku would teach me. Zuko wasn't even sure he wanted to know what that meant. The rest of the day was spent digging, mindlessly, monotonously digging, until the entire town had blistered palms and had dirt tattooed under their fingernails. Zuko dug with the rest of them, simply seething they could do nothing more to help, grimacing as the pressure built and built while he could do nothing to ease the danger to come while his bending still refused to work. Would it ever work? In the end, they were saved by some truly powerful bending by the Avatar, and the town was now ringed by black rock. But beyond a few charred roofs, the town was unharmed, beyond being completely overrun by idiots who apparently still thought that Aunt Wu was right about the volcano prediction. Not that Zuko doubted Aunt Wu's power, just maybe the timing of them? After all, he had read his destiny as one they had lost many years ago. Who was to say that the clouds weren't just running a bit behind?